Our next presenter is Mr. Aaron Wudrick from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee for having me today. For those of you unfamiliar with the Taxpayers Federation, we are a national nonpartisan nonprofit with over 235,000 supporters across Canada. We focus our advocacy on three general areas: lower taxation, less government waste, and accountable and transparent government. And I don't know if the committee members have noticed, but we are the only witness here today that does not have a direct link to the aerospace industry. And I assure that it's not my goal to alienate everybody else on the panel today, but I warn that I may end up achieving it anyway. I wanted to start really by just posing a very simple question that I think the community needs to ask itself before answering any other question. And that is, what is it about aerospace as an industry that makes it different than other industries? And I think that question is an important one because the normal starting point for most industries is that they don't require study by a parliamentary committee in the first place. Every day in Canada, we see businesses come and go. Some of them succeed, some of them fail. And in the vast majority of cases, and I would exclude, I want to be clear, I would exclude the present circumstances of this pandemic. And I understand a lot of the comments today are going to be with regard to the specific circumstances of the pandemic. I would agree that is different than business as usual, and so may require special consideration. But generally speaking, the idea of governments riding to the rescue of an industry or business does not normally occur. So we need to ask ourselves what it is about aerospace that makes it different as an industry. Now, one argument that we often hear is that it employs a lot of people. That's true, but it's also true of many other industries. And very few of those other industries receive the level of subsidy that aerospace has historically received in Canada. Another argument we often hear is that aerospace jobs pay well. That's also true. But if one has to count the cost of the subsidies, which we should be doing because the net benefit to the economy, to Canada, and indeed to government coffers, needs to include that cost as well, that argument also loses quite a bit of its attraction. Finally, it's often argued that aerospace is a strategic industry. It's crucial to an innovation economy. If that's so, it's not really clear what the strategy is other than endless subsidies, since the industry has not ever become self-sustaining in the last half century, nor has it ever been explained how innovation is best served in any industry, not just aerospace, by shielding and protecting businesses from the disciplining forces of market competition. Now, at this point, I'm sure that we have some committee members and certainly some folks on the panel thinking that that sounds very nice in theory, Mr. Wudrick, but it's terribly naive. You know, the world's not an economics textbook, and the global aerospace industry is not a real competitive market. And the harsh reality is that foreign competitors to Canadian aerospace all receive support from the respective governments. So Canada must do the same in order to level the playing field. And I take that as a very significant rebuttal, but it seems to me that it also concedes right off the top that taxpayer subsidies are not some sort of exciting opportunity, but really just a grim necessity, something that we must endure. And if they are a necessity, then we need to ask ourselves how far Canada should be prepared to go to defend this industry. If a Canadian company is up against a foreign competitor, which has access to exponentially larger subsidies from their own governments, how many billions of dollars should Canadian taxpayers be prepared to spend? Should it be $1 billion? Should it be 10 billion or 50 billion? Is there any threshold where anyone within the industry would concede that the costs start to exceed the benefits? And if so, what would that threshold be? I think another thing that's important for the committee to consider is what else are you prepared to forego in order to subsidize this industry? Despite what some folks may insist, resources are not infinite, and every dollar of support that goes to this industry is a dollar that cannot go towards something else. And if you were to ask your constituents what their highest priorities are for their own tax dollars, how many of them would tell you that subsidizing aerospace would make that list? I would just close by saying that I don't begrudge anyone in aerospace coming before you to make the case for government support for their industry. That is their job. And if their historical record is any indication, they're incredibly good at doing it. I would only ask that the committee bear in mind that when everyone in front of them is urging them to spend money, and they also stand to benefit directly from that money, that they are not exactly getting a representative sample of views on the issue. There are millions of Canadians who would end up paying the freight for such subsidies who will never appear before this committee. And all I ask is that you consider those unrepresented voices as well when making decisions about how you will support the industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll start our third round of questions. The first round goes to MP Polyev. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. My question is for Mr. Wudrick. I just want to talk to you about a challenge in public finance in general. Whenever we have these hearings on any subject, we get 20 or 30 witnesses showing up asking for more money. And we get one witness, usually you or someone like you, representing the 30 plus million Canadians who have to pay for it. So the 30 million plus Canadians who pay the price of programs get one witness, and the comparatively very small group, sometimes representing 10 or 20,000 people, get 20 or 30 witnesses. And it's not just this committee, it's every committee. In fact, it was even worse on the Finance Committee. It reminds me of John Buchanan, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist who invented something called public choice theory, where he pointed out that when governments start to run the economy, the theory is that everything's going to happen in the public interest, but in fact, people seeking profit just do so through the government rather than through the marketplace. And so they show up at committees like this one advocating for their interest group to get a bigger handout from the many millions of people who are too busy working and living their lives to lobby in the other direction. And in the end, the concentrated benefit of a government handout is far more politically powerful than the dispersed cost that everyone must contribute to pay for it. Hence, we have one witness defending the payers. Here, that's you. And throughout this study, we'll have 25 or 30 advocating for more spending. Do you have any suggestions on how we can redress this balance so that the people who pay the bills in this country, the working class folks who put in the hours and earn their wages, and the small business people across the land are not continuously outnumbered by those who want to draw from their pockets?
Well, the first thing I say is you should invite the Canadian Taxpayers Federation to committee more often. But aside from that, I think it's incumbent on the members on the committee and all members of Parliament to remember that fact, to remember that. And I don't want to take anything away from the people who appear at committee. You're all dedicated to your craft, and I'm sure all your reasoning is in earnest, and you believe in what you're saying. But there, as you say, Mr. Polliver, there are millions of Canadians who will never appear before committee. And it's incumbent upon members of Parliament to remember that it should not always be the squeaky wheel that gets the oil.
I want to start with Mr. Wudrick. When it comes to bailouts, I read an article in the Globe from an economics professor at U of T and the Rotman School, Professor Chandra, who writes, the point of bailout should be to preserve or enhance competition, not to prop up already strong companies that can exploit weakened rivals or throw money at companies that are likely to fold regardless. Do you agree with that?
I think it's probably a little more nuanced in my position. The challenge with bailout is that you tend to run into one or two problems. You're either giving money to an entity that doesn't need it, as we've seen some companies openly say, or you're giving it to companies that may not deserve it. Because as I think the professor is indicating, if they can't survive but for the subsidy, then it's probably a bad idea to give it.
But you would agree, my understanding at least, of the ethos of your organization, and I follow you online, the emphasis should be on preserving competition or enhancing competition.
Yes, competition is always the better way to determine who should succeed in the marketplace. Yes, I'd agree with that.
And when it comes to the government is committed to a bailout of the sector, so when it comes to conditions that might be imposed on such a bailout, I've seen the government publicly speak about limits on executive compensation, dividends, that there be potentially climate disclosure conditions, conditions on maintaining regional routes, and the same conditions that we see in the LEAF program, for example. But the professor that I referenced goes on to write that a significant government stake, i.e. an equity stake, will ensure that future decisions around airlines are taken with the interests of consumers and employees in mind, rather than returns to shareholders and top executives. And I wonder, if we are to have a bailout as a significant condition, do you think an equity stake would make sense?
I think the challenge there then is now you are essentially marrying government into the entity. And I realize that the purpose of joining them at the hip with the company is to ensure accountability for the taxpayer support. But the flip side is then, there's a reason that most businesses are not joining at the hip with government. If you then have businesses making decisions for reasons other than profitability and what their shareholders expect, you run into a different set of problems. I would say that, I've made that argument about concerns about use of money for things like the wage subsidy, right? But I view that as a temporary program in a unique circumstance. People support that subsidy to preserve jobs. And when they see that businesses are throwing it in the bank or giving out special dividends to shareholders, it's a problem. I would say one thing that governments can do that's relatively simple that doesn't give rise to the same problem I've just mentioned is transparency. I think if the price of admission for support for private entities is there must be full disclosure of the terms of a contract, repayment. It's been endlessly frustrating. I recognize we take a very hard line on subsidy, but I think that if governments decide they are going to support business for whatever reason, the bare minimum expectation for taxpayers is they should be able to see where the money goes, when it gets paid back, whether the contract is fulfilled.
I think we were all very impressed with some of the arguments made by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation at looking at what we can do without direct subsidy.